Kevin's conversation with extraterrestrials. Kevin Kamen, at the time, was a Navy medic, a corpsman, and was stationed on this Navy ship since 1978, and was on the ship for a number of years. His bunkmate and someone who became his best friend, I'll call him Larry. And Kevin Kamen and Larry became good friends because they shared the same room. Kevin was a medic, as I mentioned, and Larry was a personnel clerk. And one day, Larry comes up to Kevin and says, "You know, I'm a UFO contactee." Kevin had always believed in UFOs. He did a paper on them when he was a little kid in grade school. But it was quite a big pill to swallow when his best friend, who he had known for a number of years, said, "I'm a contactee." And Kevin's like, "Really?" And Larry said, "Yes. In fact, I've been in contact with them since I was a little boy. They often took him from his home." He says he's been on their ship many, many times and has even visited their planet. Kevin was skeptical and didn't know what to make of his friend's story. It was just a couple of days later when Larry came into the cabin and says, "Oh, I just visited my ET friends and they took me to your house." And Kevin was again skeptical, said, "Really?" And Larry said yes, and proceeded to describe Kevin's house in detail. He described their Ford Galaxy car, the chocolate milkshake stain on the back seat, the shag carpets they had, all these details about his bedroom, all of which were perfectly accurate. Only one thing that concerned Kevin was that while these details were accurate, they were not current. Larry seemed to be describing his house as it appeared some years earlier in the early to mid 1970s, which made no sense. It was almost as if his friend Larry had perhaps time traveled. He couldn't think of any other explanation. He thought maybe Larry was part of the CIA, but that didn't make any sense. They were stuck on board this Navy ship. There was no way Larry could know these details. But it convinced Kevin that something very strange was going on with his friend. And he says, "Okay, if you're truly a UFO contactee, I'd like to meet your little green friends." That was the phrase he used. "I want to meet your little green friends." And Larry just smiled and said, "Okay, I'll see if I can arrange it." And it was just a couple of days later when Larry approached Kevin and said, "Well, I talked to them and they agreed. They said that they will meet with you, and in fact, they will come tomorrow." And Kevin was still a little skeptical and wasn't sure what was going to happen. But the next day arrived, and it was around high noon, lunchtime. Kevin was on his lunch break. It had just begun when Larry came into the cabin and said, "It's okay, they're here. If you want to see them, go out on deck and you will see them." So Kevin, still skeptical, walked out on deck. It was just a short walk from his cabin to the top deck. And as soon as he got out on deck, he got a huge shock. There was a very large craft floating alongside this ship. It was much bigger than the ship itself. The ship itself was, some 600, 700 feet long. And there were many people out on deck, and none of them appeared to notice this very huge craft, which was extremely visible to Kevin. I mean, it was much bigger than the ship itself. It was flashing all these brilliant colored lights. It looked almost like a diamond floating there in the sky, like a star-like shape. You couldn't quite tell the shape, but it was very apparent and very strange. So Kevin immediately ran over to the nearest person. It turned out to be the mess cook, and tried to point out this craft to him. The cook paid no attention to him at all. Kevin could not get his attention. And the next thing Kevin realizes is he's not on the Navy ship anymore. He is looking down at the Navy ship from above. He looks down at where he's standing and can see what looks like a metal grate, like a fire escape. He's looking through the wall and the floor, which becomes transparent, and can see the Navy ship getting smaller and smaller and turning into this tiny little dot, as if he's in this ship and it's going straight up. He could see that he was standing next to a sort of chest-high console of some kind. It had little, what looked like oven dials and colored lights, amber, red, green. It was not complicated. It reminded him almost of a Star Trek set. Kevin was freaking out. He had a very strong wave of fear pulse through him when he realized that he was no longer on the Navy ship. He was apparently inside this craft. He actually pinched his hand so hard that it bled. And he thought to himself, oh my God, I'm AWOL. And this is when these ETs started to speak with him. And they said, in perfect English, telepathically, he heard a male voice say, no, you're not. They don't even know you're gone. Kevin thought to himself, my God, this can't be happening. This can't be true. And another male voice spoke in perfect English, yes, it is. It's what you wanted. So Kevin was pretty shook up. He was too afraid to turn around and look at these guys, so he just continued to sort of face the wall. And suddenly there was a shift, or this craft moved. He felt no movement, but suddenly it was in a different place. And he was shocked to see that he was hovering over his hometown of Kankakee, Illinois. It was very strange because it was daytime in Kankakee, Illinois. It was also daytime on the ship where he had just been in the Philippines. So that didn't make any sense. It also kind of indicated to him that this was not the present moment he was looking at, that they must have time traveled again, perhaps. At any rate, he was very low over his hometown of Kankakee, in fact, at treetop level. And this UFO that he was inside was hovering next to the bank building where his father worked. His father worked in the center of the building, he had his own office, and Kevin was shocked that he could not only see through the wall of the UFO, but through the wall of the bank building all the way into his father's office. His father was there at his desk with some other co-workers, and they were apparently having some kind of meeting. Suddenly this UFO that he was inside darted just a few blocks away and hovered over the church where his mom taught grade school. And once again, he could see through the wall of the craft, through the wall of this church, into this classroom where his mom was teaching. In fact, he could see the writing on the chalkboard. She was teaching biblical phrases, and he could see the phrase, his countenance was white as snow. And at this point, the ETs gave him a very strange message. They said, you have good parents. Your mother and father are both honorable people. They are very good people and have done a good job. This concerned him because he's like, wow, these ETs know my parents. What's going on? Next thing he knows, there's another shift, and he's hovering over his childhood home. And now he knew for a fact that they must have time traveled because he saw himself as a young boy, and there was his grandmother sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, sending him off to the local store. And his grandmother had died in 1972, so it's had to be prior to that. And he watched himself walk all the way to the local store before suddenly there was another shift, and suddenly Kevin found himself looking down at what appeared to be a desert landscape. He's not quite sure of the order of these events, and perhaps more things happened, because this was all very traumatic, very sudden. But at any rate, he's looking down at what appears to be a desert landscape, and he saw that there are craters in it, and he's thinking, well, what is this? Is this a bombing area? What is this? It looked kind of this grayish, sandy soil, and he's trying to figure out where on earth could this be, when suddenly the craft started moving, and they came up over this rise, and he got a tremendous shock when he saw the Earth in the distance. The planet Earth, it was about the size of a basketball, and that's when he realized that they were in fact hovering right over the moon. The moonscape was very, very close, and he says he it was such a shock, he nearly soiled his pants right then and there. And this is when his conversation with the ETs really began in earnest. And Kevin was still too nervous to turn around and see what these guys looked like. But he did have the presence of mind to start asking questions. And the first question he asked was, "Where are you from?" And the ETs didn't answer directly with a phrase. Instead, they demonstrated. Suddenly, this room, which had been quite small, originally maybe 20 feet wide, he couldn't quite tell, but it immediately expanded to a very large size, 50, 100 feet wide, 200 feet, maybe more. And the room transformed, and suddenly he found himself in the middle of this three-dimensional star chart. He could see Earth, he could see the sun, he could see the other planets, and stars stretching way off, way off into the distance. And at the very far end of the room, where the stars were just tiny little dots, he saw this red light blinking on and off. And one of the ETs said, "That's where we are from." And then they proceeded to tell him the name of their planet and the name of their species, which Kevin is not quite able to remember. All he really recalls is that these were very long words with lots of consonants, and was a foreign language, and he just couldn't make sense of it, and he couldn't remember what these words were. But they told him that the ETs proceeded to start giving him all kinds of information. They told him that they speak all the languages of our planet fluently. And Kevin says, "Well, why are you here?" And one of the ETs replied, "We have been here a long time. Our objective is only to observe. We are not here to interfere with your religious beliefs or your political beliefs. We are only here to observe." Kevin asks, "Well, what do you eat? Or do you eat?" And the ETs said, "Yes, we eat." And Kevin, still nervous that this was perhaps a negative experience, said, "Are you going to eat me?" And the ET said, "No, you watch too many horror movies. We are not going to eat you. We are here only to observe." And they proceeded to give him a bunch of information. They told him that when humans began testing atomic weapons, it caused them to pay much closer attention to humans, and that it also drew the interest of many other ET species. As Kevin says, "They told me when we exploded the atomic bomb, that started a countdown clock." They didn't tell him exactly what that meant in words. Instead, they showed him these images. These were three-dimensional images. It was as if he was looking out a window at the Earth, and they showed him a series of natural disasters, future natural disasters, that would occur all over our planet. And again, this was all in vivid three-dimensional. It looked totally lifelike, as if he was actually there. And as Kevin says, they showed me mudslides and volcanic eruptions, hurricanes and floods and more hurricanes. These were natural disasters that were going to happen. They told him, quote, "These are things that are going to come." They told him there was no way we could stop these events, that because of our messing around with atomic weapons, that all these events would in fact occur. So Kevin started to ask all kinds of questions. The Roswell UFO crash came to his mind, and he asked if that was real. And as Kevin says, "They told me the Roswell crash was true. They told me that they themselves did not have a government. They told me that they do interact with our government, and that there were 4 other species that they knew of that also interact with our government. And not only do they interact with our government, they interact with most of the other major governments on the face of the earth, and they have been doing so for years and years." They said, "Yes, we interact with your government all the time, and we are trading technology with them." They also said that they can cloak themselves, and that if there's a group of people standing around, they can make themselves visible to half the group and not to half the group. They can show themselves to whoever they want or cloak themselves from whoever they want. At one point, Kevin asked them flat out, "Is there a God?" And he says that question seemed to disturb them and shake them up a little bit. And they replied, and I quote, "We cannot answer that question. We have a higher authority to answer to, and we are not allowed to discuss it." They told him again that they could not discuss religion or politics with him. And after talking to him about all these various subjects, Kevin finally asked, "Well, what do you look like?" And the ET replied, "Well, we're not little and we're not green." And they sort of evaded the question, so Kevin thought again. All his questions were pure thought, and all the ET's answers were also telepathic. And the ET said, "We don't look like you." And Kevin said, "Okay, that's nice." And the ET replied, "Sometimes we might scare you if you look at us." So Kevin finally mustered up the courage to turn around, and he got a pretty bad shock when he looked at them. And he was a little scared, because these were not typical grays. What he saw were praying mantis. There were 3 of them. They were in the center of this sort of large round room. There was a large sort of raised platform like a stage, and these 3 praying mantis ETs were each sitting on what looked like large white stone chairs with very high backs. And these were very large praying mantis type ETs, huge heads. He says one of their eyeballs was probably about the size of a basketball. And one of them stood up and in 1 or 2 strides walked right up to him and started fussing around with the little dials on this chest-high console, and stood right next to Kevin, who had to look up at him. And Kevin estimates that these figures were at least 15 feet in height, more than twice his own height, and easily 15 feet high. And he felt another strong wave of fear. He was very much afraid of being taken as a specimen or not being allowed to return. At this point, the ET who was standing right next to him looked down at him. He says they radiated intelligence. It looked down at him and said, "Would you like to go to our planet?" And Kevin replied, "No, no thank you." And at that point, this praying mantis ET reached out and grabbed Kevin's shoulder, and that caused Kevin quite a bit of fear. Next thing he knows, he's back on the Navy ship, and he's laying down in his bed, in his room. And he was hyperventilating. His entire body was coated with sweat. He was very scared and was just beginning to calm down when suddenly the curtain surrounding his bed whips open, and there's his bunkmate, his friend Larry, smiling, grinning from ear to ear, and says, "So, how did you like your little ride?" Well, Kevin was pretty traumatized. He wasn't happy, and he, in fact, was pretty upset and sort of broke off the friendship with his friend Larry, which I think he regrets. But at that time, it was just too much for him to take, and he stopped talking to Larry. And it wasn't long after this experience, which occurred in 1982, that he was honorably discharged from the Navy and returned home. And strangely, most of this experience left his mind shortly after it occurred. He did remember something happened. He knew he had missing time, some sort of contact. He had just little bits and pieces of memory of being taken on board. Did not remember what these guys looked like or anything like that. Didn't remember any of the conversation. But he did know that he was very afraid of his friend Larry, and actually had suppressed this memories of this experience for quite some time. One day he was watching television with his wife when a nature show came on, and the nature show was featuring praying mantis insects. And suddenly there was a close-up on one of the praying mantis insects, and Kevin started shaking. He turned pale, and all the memories of this incident that had occurred some years earlier came flooding back into his mind. And he remembered, he had that motorcycle accident, which he did survive. And as the years started to pass, he saw some of these natural disasters that he had seen on the ship start to occur. And so this whole experience, was pretty traumatizing for him, even though it was essentially benign. And it really shook him up. And it's taken him a long time to come to terms with it. At first he thought this was a one-time experience. But on future occasions he woke up and found strange scars or scoop marks on his body. And he's concerned that his experiences are still ongoing and that perhaps he has an implant. He can't be sure. But Kevin has gone public with his experiences. He did allow his real name to be used. He's appeared on the radio a number of times. And he thinks it's very important that people know that these beings are out there and that we are not alone in this universe.